He was only 10 years old, but his defense shocked the entire courtroom. No one expected such a small child to speak with such conviction, yet there he was, standing tall, his eyes filled with tears and his voice trembling, facing powerful adults who had never been challenged like this before. The entire room fell silent as Caleb took a deep breath and said something no one could ignore. His father, handcuffed beside the defense attorney, looked at him with a mixture of pride and despair. His mother, sitting in the front row, clenched her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Everyone had expected a frightened child, too young to grasp the seriousness of the situation, but Caleb proved them wrong with his very first words. The judge tilted his head slightly, intrigued, while the prosecutor adjusted his glasses, as if trying to find flaws in the unexpected courage of the young boy. What no one knew was that Caleb had spent sleepless nights listening behind doors, observing every detail, piecing together things that no one else seemed to notice. And now, with dozens of eyes locked on him, he was ready to reveal what really happened that night. Outside the courtroom, Caleb's life seemed ordinary. But anyone who looked closely would realize that this 10-year-old boy carried burdens no child should have to bear. The house he lived in was simple, worn by time, and his parents' arguments were constant, even when they tried to whisper. Caleb would spend hours hidden behind the bedroom door, listening to every word, trying to make sense of what was happening. He knew things were tough, but he never imagined he'd see his own father taken away in handcuffs, without even having a chance to say goodbye. That night changed everything. Caleb was sitting on the couch, trying to finish his homework, when the police burst into the house. His mother screamed. His father tried to argue, but no one listened. The boy stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, watching the fear in his little sister's eyes as she clung to his arm like it was the only safe place in the world. Their mother tried to reassure them, saying everything would be sorted out soon, but Caleb knew it was a lie. He saw something that no one else did, a small detail that had been stuck in his mind ever since, and it was that detail that brought him to the courtroom. After the arrest, the house was never the same. Silence became suffocating, and their mother always seemed exhausted, trying to hold everything together on her own. Caleb wanted to help, but he was just a kid. At least, that's what everyone told him. But deep down, he knew that if he spoke up about what he saw that night, maybe, just maybe, he could change everything. The problem was, no one was willing to listen to a 10-year-old boy. Ever since his father was taken away, Caleb's house had never known peace again. His mother spent her days on the phone, trying to understand what had happened, while his younger sister kept asking questions no one had answers to. Caleb tried to be strong, but every night, he could hear his mother crying in her room, thinking he was asleep. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't just the absence of noise, but a heavy emptiness that made everything feel even more overwhelming. What hurt the most was knowing that no one believed in his father. The neighbors whispered, his classmates at school looked at him differently, and even relatives avoided talking about it. "We'll get through this," his mother would say, trying to smile, but Caleb knew she had doubts too. He could see it in her eyes every time she received a letter from the lawyer, or came back from the police station without any answers. But Caleb was sure of one thing. His father was innocent. He knew it because he had seen something that night. A small detail that no one else seemed to notice. Something insignificant to others, but crucial to him. The problem was, no one listened to a 10-year-old boy. And that made his blood boil. He wanted to scream it to the world, but every time he tried to bring it up, his mother would shut him down. "This isn't something for kids, Caleb," she would say, looking at him with that tired expression. One day, during a heated phone call, Caleb overheard his mother saying that maybe it was best to accept the deal offered by the prosecution. Her voice trembled. Caleb understood what that meant. If she signed those papers, his father would plead guilty to something he didn't do. Something inside Caleb shattered. He couldn't let that happen. That night, as he stared at the family photo hanging on the wall, he made a decision. If the adults wouldn't do anything, he would. He grabbed an old notebook and started writing down everything he remembered from that night. Every single detail. Because deep down, he knew the truth had to come out. It was a cold night, and Caleb remembered every detail as if it had happened yesterday. He was in his room, scribbling drawings in his notebook, when he heard the front door burst open. His father rushed in, his face tense, eyes darting around. His mother stood up from the couch, alarmed. "What's going on, Henry?" she asked, but he didn't answer. He just locked the door behind him and looked out the window, as if he were running from something. Caleb watched everything through the crack in his bedroom door, holding his breath, his chest tightening. Minutes later, sirens echoed down the street. Red and blue lights flashed through the living room window. The police barged in without knocking, shouting, pointing their guns, treating his father like a dangerous criminal. His father raised his hands, trying to explain, but they didn't give him a chance. "You're under arrest, Henry Parker," one of the officers said, snapping the cold metal handcuffs onto his wrists. His mother screamed. His little sister started crying, and Caleb just stood there, frozen, feeling a lump in his throat that he could never quite describe. As the officers searched the house, Caleb saw it. It was quick, but he saw it. The man in the dark jacket standing across the street, watching everything with a faint smirk on his face. No one else noticed. And in that moment, Caleb knew something was wrong. But when he tried to speak up, no one listened. "Everything's going to be fine," his mother said, trying to hide the fear in her eyes. But Caleb knew it wouldn't be. He knew his father hadn't done anything wrong, but who would believe him? After the door shut and the police car took his father away, the house fell into silence. A heavy silence that seemed to seep into the walls. His mother sat on the couch without saying a word, staring at the floor as if searching for answers. Caleb walked over and held her hand, trying to tell her with that small gesture that they were still together. But deep down, he knew that wasn't enough. Something had to be done, and he was going to do it. Caleb had never been inside a courtroom before. The place felt cold, with towering walls and a silence that made everything seem even more intimidating. The chairs creaked every time someone moved, and the judge, a stern-looking man with weary eyes, appeared to scrutinize every detail carefully. Caleb's mother sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. His father, sitting up front, looked smaller than ever, the handcuffs on his wrists reflecting the bright lights in the room. When the defense attorney called Caleb to the stand, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some people whispered, others looked surprised. A 10-year-old boy wasn't supposed to be there. His legs trembled as he walked to the center, but he didn't hesitate. He climbed onto the chair they offered him, looking first at the prosecutor, then at the judge. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Just tell the truth, Caleb, only the truth." He took a deep breath and began. "I was there, and I saw who was standing across the street that night." His voice was steady, and the room fell silent. The prosecutor, who had been flipping through papers absent-mindedly, looked up, intrigued. The judge folded his arms. Caleb continued, "It wasn't my dad. There was a man standing on the corner, wearing a dark jacket. I saw him watching our house, and he left before the police even got there." His mother discreetly wiped away a tear. The defense attorney leaned forward, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The prosecutor cleared her throat, ready to interrupt, but Caleb didn't stop. "No one wanted to listen to me before, but I remember everything." He pointed to the side of the courtroom where a few people were seated. "I know what I saw." The judge pressed his lips together, studying Caleb closely. For a moment, it seemed like everyone in the room had forgotten that he was just a child. The truth, spoken by someone so young, carried a different weight. From the defendant's bench, Caleb's father looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of pride and sadness. His mother closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and in that instant, for the first time, the silence in the courtroom didn't feel so frightening anymore. Caleb felt his throat go dry, but he didn't look away. He knew that every word had to be chosen carefully, because this was his only chance to help his father. The judge kept his eyes fixed on him, fingers interlocked on the desk, while the prosecutor leaned in, trying to catch any flaw in the boy's story. Caleb clenched his hands on his knees and continued. "That night, after I finished my homework, I heard a noise outside. I looked out the window and saw that man standing there, staring at our house. He was wearing a dark jacket with a hood. I remember it clearly because the streetlight hit him for just a second before he walked away. My dad was still inside, with me and my sister. The courtroom remained utterly silent. The defense attorney scribbled a quick note, while Caleb's mother kept her eyes locked on him, as if each word he spoke was a glimmer of hope. The judge took a deep breath and asked in a firm voice, "Are you absolutely sure about this, son?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. I'll never forget it." The prosecutor let out a dry, forced laugh. "Caleb, you're just a kid. Sometimes our imagination plays tricks on us. Are you sure you didn't mistake him for someone else?" Caleb felt a tightness in his chest. He glanced at his father, who kept his head down, and then at his mother, who had tears in her eyes. He couldn't back down now. "I know what I saw," he said firmly. "And if you check the cameras on that street, you'll see it too. There's one right above Mr. Evans' grocery store. It was there that night." The prosecutor exchanged a worried glance with her team. Murmurs filled the courtroom, and for the first time, Caleb realized that people were actually listening. The judge raised a hand, signaling for silence. "We will investigate this," he said, his voice more serious now. Caleb's mother placed a hand over her heart, and a wave of relief washed over his father's face. He lifted his head, looking at his son as if he had never been prouder. Caleb knew he had done something important, but he also knew it wasn't over yet. The tension inside the courtroom grew with every passing second. The judge looked at the attorneys, then at the prosecutor, and finally at Caleb, who remained seated with his hands nervously fidgeting in his lap. The murmurs among the attendees grew louder. It was clear that no one had expected a 10-year-old boy to bring something so significant to the case. His mother discreetly wiped away tears, while his father, sitting at the defendant's table, seemed to struggle against the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The prosecutor stood up, attempting to regain control of the situation. "We have heard this boy's testimony, Your Honor, but we still lack concrete evidence. These are just words," she said with confidence, but Caleb could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "The mentioned security cameras may not show anything relevant." The defense attorney didn't waste a second. He rose calmly, looked at the judge, and said, "Your Honor, if there are cameras, they need to be checked. I believe we can request footage from the night in question." The judge pondered for a moment before striking the gavel. "Request granted. I want those recordings presented at the next hearing." The prosecutor's expression hardened, and Caleb saw his mother clench her hands tightly. There was hope, but it still wasn't enough. As the session was adjourned, Caleb climbed down from the chair slowly. His mother wrapped him in a tight hug, her familiar scent offering a brief moment of comfort amid the fear. "You were incredible, sweetheart," she whispered. But Caleb knew this was far from over. As they stepped out of the courthouse, Caleb spotted him, the man in the dark jacket, standing across the street. He was there again, watching, as if he knew he had been mentioned. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, and he tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing subtly. "Mom, it's him." His mother glanced quickly, but the man had already disappeared into the crowd. "Caleb, we're all nervous. Maybe it was just your imagination," she said, trying to reassure him. But Caleb knew what he had seen, and he knew that man wasn't there by chance. That night, Caleb lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The court was willing to listen, but would it be enough? He couldn't let fear stop him. Not now. Outside the courthouse, the cold wind cut across Caleb's face, but he barely felt it. His mind was stuck on the image of that man in the dark jacket, the same one he had seen the night his father was arrested. He glanced at his mother, who was trying to act as if everything was under control, but Caleb knew she was just as scared. Everything felt like a giant puzzle, and he was the only one trying to put the pieces together. The next day, their defense attorney arrived at their home, looking more hopeful than usual. "We have the security footage," he said, opening a folder filled with papers. Caleb's mother held her breath as he leaned in eagerly. "And?" Caleb asked, his heart pounding in anticipation. The attorney adjusted his glasses and explained. "The footage shows a man walking out from the back alley at the exact moment the police arrived. The quality isn't great, but you can see the dark jacket." Caleb's mother covered her mouth, overwhelmed with emotion. Caleb felt a surge of hope rush through him. "It's him. I knew I saw him," he exclaimed, barely able to contain his excitement. The attorney placed a reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder and smiled. "You made a difference, kid. Now we have something concrete." But victory still felt distant. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor rose confidently, downplaying the footage. "This could be anyone. It doesn't prove anything beyond mere coincidence." The defense attorney pushed back, requesting a more thorough analysis of the images, while Caleb watched anxiously, his palms sweating. He glanced at his father, who closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if allowing himself to hope again. The judge called for a recess to review the new evidence, and Caleb left the courtroom with his heart racing. He knew they were getting closer to proving the truth, but he also knew it wasn't over yet. As they walked down the hallway, he held his mother's hand tightly and whispered, "I won't give up, Mom. I promise." She looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes, and squeezed his hand in response. The tension in the courtroom was almost suffocating. Caleb sat beside his mother, feeling his cold hands and racing heartbeat. The judge adjusted her glasses and called for silence as the defense attorney slowly stood up, holding a printed image of the mysterious man on the corner. Caleb knew this was the most important moment. Everything he had done so far led to this. "What we have here, Your Honor," the attorney began, holding up the enlarged photo, "is the presence of an unknown man leaving the scene at the exact moment the police arrived. Caleb Parker, just 10 years old, was the only one to notice it. And now we have proof that he was right." The prosecutor crossed her arms, forcing a confident smile. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this does not prove the defendant's innocence. Anyone could have been passing by at that time." Frustration bubbled inside Caleb. He looked at his father, sitting ahead, his eyes weary, as if he was bracing for yet another disappointment. That's when Caleb suddenly stood up, drawing everyone's attention. His mother tried to pull him back, but he took a step forward. "If I saw that man, why didn't anyone else try to look for him?" His voice echoed across the room. "Why did no one listen to me before?" The judge furrowed her brows, gazing at Caleb with a mix of surprise and intrigue. The defense attorney gave a small smile and took the lead again. "This boy did what none of us did." He paid attention. "And now we have another piece of evidence. We request a more detailed analysis of all surrounding security cameras." The courtroom murmured, and the prosecutor seemed uneasy. She shuffled through her papers quickly before standing up again. "Your Honor, we can wait for a more thorough review, but until we have definitive proof, the case should proceed based on the current evidence." The judge took a long pause before speaking. "The truth needs to be uncovered. We will wait for the forensic analysis before making any decisions." Relief flooded Caleb's chest. His mother took a deep breath, squeezing his hand. His father turned around, his eyes filled with a cautious hope. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the truth felt within reach. Time seemed to crawl as everyone waited for the results of the camera footage analysis. Caleb stared at his hands, feeling his fingers fidget anxiously. His mother sat beside him, trying to stay composed, but he noticed how she clutched the fabric of her dress, something she always did when she was nervous. Across the room, his father hardly blinked. Every second of waiting felt like an eternity. When the court officer walked in holding a folder, the entire room fell silent. The defense attorney quickly stood, flipping through the pages inside. He looked up, and for the first time, Caleb saw a spark of hope in his eyes. "Your Honor, the new footage clearly shows a man leaving the alley and getting into a black car parked at the corner. This confirms Caleb's testimony and raises serious doubts about the initial investigation." The prosecutor skimmed through the documents, her once confident expression now more cautious. "We need more time to analyze this information." The judge struck the gavel, ending the debate. There has been more than enough time. The prosecution had their chance to investigate, and now we have a witness with concrete evidence. The court must reconsider the charges against the defendant. Caleb felt a shock of emotion run through him. He looked at his mother, who covered her face, letting out a sob of relief. His father, sitting at the defense table, lowered his head for a moment, taking a deep breath before looking at Caleb with something different in his eyes, a mix of silent pride and overwhelming gratitude. Moments later, when the judge read the final decision, Caleb felt the world around him blur. His father was free. Caleb watched as his father slowly stood, as if afraid to believe it was real. His mother rushed to him, and they embraced tightly, as if they would never let go again. Caleb stood still, watching them, and felt a warm tear roll down his cheek. As they walked out of the courthouse, the world outside felt different. People still looked at them, but now without suspicion. There was respect in their eyes. His mother wrapped an arm around Caleb's shoulders and whispered, "You saved our family, sweetheart." He smiled, unsure of what to say. But deep down, Caleb knew this story would stay with him forever. He had learned that sometimes the truth takes time to be heard, and that courage has nothing to do with age. And what about you? Have you ever had to find the courage to tell the truth, even when no one wanted to listen? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear it.